So thanks all for joining us here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging country. I'm here on the stolen lands of the Murrumbuck clan of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, while Victoria University is based more generally on the lands of the Bunurong, Woiwurrung and Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, along with the Gadigal and Gurungai people of the Eora Nation. I want to honour, recognise and respect the ancestors, elders and families of these people, and to note that their lands, like all of the country that makes up the illegal nation of Australia, have never been ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge and give my respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. It's a privilege to be chairing this seminar, Talking Black, Finding and Owning First Nations Voice, Belonging and Connection Through the Archives by Kathy Travis. Kathy is a PhD student here at Victoria University and the Lisa Bellar Scholar at VU. Lisa Bellar was a Gurnpool, Minjibul and South Sea Islander activist, Black feminist, photographer, radio broadcaster, academic, poet and performer, among other things. Among these many vital things, Lisa was deeply interested in Aboriginal women's rights and education, which she saw as central to the fight for justice and free expression for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and lives on in the legacy of the throng of women, students, activists, artists, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people she championed and inspired. You can read more about Lisa Bellar in many places, including the Australian Dictionary biography entry written by Lisa's cousin and Mundani Bullock staff member, Kim Kruger. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Kathy.
Thank you, Matthew, and thanks, Chris, for providing this opportunity for me. Bit of a new experience for me to be doing it, so bear with me. And I also have a really bad case of hay fever today, so I'm going to just start by, I think I can share my screen. Can everyone see that? Yep. Okay, let me just go from here. Okay, so firstly, I want to begin also by acknowledging that I'm presenting to you today from Wadawurrung country. So I'm sitting in Bellar Peninsula, 40 minutes out from Geelong. It is the traditional lands of my children, Lachlan, Tegan and Jordan on their father's side, and I pay my respects to them, to their elders past, present and those emerging, and acknowledge their ongoing commitment to the land and the waterways, to which there is many of such waterways around me. I acknowledge and pay my respect also to First Nations people who've joined us today. And I also acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded, always was, always will be. So word A, in my language, that means hello. My name is Kath Upma Panunka Travis and I'm a proud Aranda woman. My traditional lands are in the southern lands of Alice Springs on my great-grandmother's side and to the central and western desert area on my great-grandfather's side. I'm a third generation stolen generation survivor and a First Nations family historian. And I just want to begin with this slide. I would like to start with this because it's a way in which I can ground myself, particularly as I'm not standing in front of you physically today. The first slide up here, if you can see my cursor, is of Simpson's Gap. It's on my great-grandfather's country in Alice Springs. I love to sit in this place where I feel the wind as I walk down towards the water. It's like having his breath upon me, guiding me to a place in which I just have some solitude. This place over here, the red, chalky, dusty road, is on the road to a place called Walkabout Bore. It's on my great-grandmother's country, Purdom country, the lower part of southern part of Alice Springs. It's where the homelands are of my family. It's where I like to get down to the very far end of this 230k road. And I feel the expanse. It's like my great-grandmother's arms opening up and embracing me as I return back to country. And on the slide down here is at Glen Helen Gorge, also just outside of Alice Springs. And in this photo, I have my mother, my sister, and my children with me. And it's just a place that we like to go to and reflect. And finally, as another form of grounding, of course, is my grandbabies. I have little Mandara here, who's now 3, nearly 4, and his little sister, Lakora Lena, who's 2. So it's just a place in which I can ground myself in preparation for this paper today. So I just want to set the scene really. Throughout this paper, I will be using the term First Nations people or First Peoples. I'll also be using a term of Second Nations. When using First Nations people or First Peoples, I'm referring to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Australia. Second Nations, the term, came from a project out of a Williamstown project with traditional owner Caroline Martin of the Bunawurrung Foundation. She'd contracted my husband, a Second Nations person of English, Irish, Scottish and French descent, to work on a shared history project together. And they developed this title for their project, and I've continued to use the term Second Nations to describe anyone who is not First Peoples of this colony we now call Australia. Today, I want to share with you my personal experiences of disconnection, loss of identity, and the burden of intergenerational trauma. I will offer my learnings from my archival research that has included documentary evidence, personal and the historical narrative that I captured as I re-authored the narrative in the form of my family cultural artefact that is a HER-storical biography. My research reflects on the centrality of First Peoples, family and kinship, identity, place, belonging and cultural connectedness, and shares the process of navigating how to weave stories of the past within stories of the present in order to re-author, retell and rematriate a new family narrative back to family and back to country. I do this because knowing yourself runs deeper than knowing your parents and where they come from. Knowing yourself, I mean truly knowing yourself, involves having a true understanding of where you come from. But I also like to think of it as who you come from. So this is a quote from my uncle, Dr. Charles Perkins, a proud Aranda man, most well known for 1965 freedom rides across New South Wales. I like to remember him as an agitator, facilitator, and enabler for change. We cannot live in the past, but the past lives in us. That is the truth. It is from this quote that I see myself as agitator, facilitator, and enabler for change. It is through this process that I speak my truths, to share the historical atrocities of the past. I believe we have to understand the past deeply and intrinsically in order for us to propel into the future. To gain a deeper understanding of our colonial history and the collective trauma that resides within the colony, we have to talk about the past because it is very much front and centre here in the present for us as First Peoples. As a society, we need truth-telling, but it must involve having honest conversations about this continent's history. It means dropping into a place of deep listening, for reciprocity, to be open to witness the courage of vulnerability. When this occurs, it has the potential to contextualise the healing of the lived experiences and honours the individual and shared social and emotional well-being of all of us in order for us to heal as a collective. Today, I take this opportunity to reflect on the centrality of First Peoples' family and kinship, identity, place, belonging and cultural connectedness by sharing with you my own and my family's disconnection, loss of identity, and the burden of the intergenerational trauma that has been and continues still today in our family. My research is based on the foundational work of my 2019 Bachelor of Arts Honours degree, and I'll just be upfront here. It was in 2019 or 2017 when I commenced my Bachelor of Arts that I'd entered university for the first time in my life as a 53-year-old. This degree explored the intergenerational cultural impact and the consequences of disconnection to country, of government legislation and the forcible removal of First Nations children. In all the states and territories that comprise Australia, where children were and can still be silently moved away from community, and in some instances lose their identity completely, stories lie woven throughout the colonial archives, where First Peoples were the object and subject of the gaze of the colonial authorities and experts. 200 years of constant and deliberate disruption, dislocation and mistreatment of First Peoples has not just been experienced individually, but collectively, between generations and across communities. For many First Peoples, our stories are still locked in police files, exemption files, child welfare reports, and in some instances, privately owned records, meaning that we're not always able to locate our story or own our identity. It means for many First Nations people who've been impacted on by government policies, we need to undertake extensive archival research in order to know our family history. My research comes from a very personal place. It is an exploration of the history of my family, 50 plus years of searching for my identity and trying to belong. You see, my grandmother, my mother, my two sisters and I were forcibly removed from each other and our families as children, spanning from a period from 1920 until 1969. I know that my research is hard emotional labour, yet it is so very important. Using archival materials and government records, I was able to reauthor a new family story. I created a family legacy in the form of a cultural artefact and it's a self-published family HER-storical biography titled Minnie, Mum and Me, the Black-Headed Snake. It was written as a deeply engaging narrative using description and dialogue, personal reflection and historical detail, allowing me to bring the women within my family out of obscurity from the historical record and to honour the voices of my grandmother and my mother and myself even, where our voices had not been heard before. It's hard to see in this slide, but it's quite a large book. Coffee table size book is what I'd like to call it. Created purposefully big because I didn't want my children to lose the book, throw it under a bed or whatever. And family members contributed to the design of the book. So, for example, the artwork was done by my niece when she was still at school. It was her first piece of artwork, and she's since, 4 or 5 years now on, she's just finished designing the artwork for the Melbourne Vixens netball. So I think, it's been a contributing process from all of the family. So I want to start just with a little bit of info about my family. I want to start with my grandmother. And in this photo, my grandmother is aged 11. She's the taller of the two children in this photo. It's in this photo at the age of 11 that she was violently stolen from her parents in 1920 from Central Australia by the anthropologist, geologist and medical practitioner, Dr. Herbert Bazadow. Bazadow was on his third medical expedition funded by pastoral and mining company interests, ostensibly to examine First Nations people's health in the lower southern part of the Northern Territory. In June of 1920, Bazadow arrived at a place called Crown Point Station. It is here where he examined Minnie, my nan. And he also examined her father, my great-grandfather, Charlie Atmar. Afterwards, when Charlie Atmar was out bush, he abducted Minnie, removing her from her people and her country. He loaded her into the back of his camel-drawn buggy to Adelaide, where she was to be enslaved in the Bazadow household, apparently invisible to government authorities for 8 years, despite the protests of at least 3 deputations between 1922 and 1932 by her father, my great-grandfather, a senior lawman, and other Aranda elders. He demanded that she be returned to him and her country. This is a telegram written in the voice of my great-grandfather by the Secretary of Aborigines Friends Association, Reverend John Henry Sexton and Mr. Elliott. It reads, and addressed to Dr. Bazadow in Adelaide. I am Charlie Atmar, proper father and longer Minnie. My girl, you've been taken from New Crown. His mother Yulda sit down along a horseshoe bend all about me, mother, sister and brother. Sorry, Alonga Minnie. You send him back quick, please. Send him letter, Horseshoe Bend, Mr. Elliot. What time Minnie come back? It was written in 1928. And as many times as I've read that, I still find it hard to read. Sorry. Upon the sudden death of Bazadow in 1933, my grandmother was treated like a family heirloom. She was passed over to the Bazadow's unmarried sisters for further enslavement. The South Australian government was complicit in this process. She'd been bound in servitude, unable to go home and unlikely to marry. It was never expected that my grandmother was to have children. But despite the odds, she did. A son born in 1942 and then a daughter born in 1943. But both were taken from my grandmother's care in very different ways. Her son was kept in the care of the Bazadow sisters until 1963. In fact, he lived inside the home, which was quite a very large estate, with the Bazadow sisters, while my grandmother lived in a smaller house out on the property, where she was able to come in and out of the house to cook and clean. Unfortunately, my uncle passed in 1996. He was unmarried and without children. He'd spent most of his life in New South Wales prisons. My grandmother's daughter, my mother, at the age of 2 weeks, was taken and placed in Colebrook Training Home, a children's institution for First Nations children run by the United Aborigines Mission. She was under the UAM control for a further 26 years, during which time she had 3 children of her own, including me, all of whom were taken from her. My grandmother finally returned to Alice Springs in 1958. She passed in 1990. Her mother and father had both passed without ever seeing their daughter again. I reunited with my mother and my sisters and my grandmother when I was 19. 5 women across 3 generations reuniting is an extremely unusual occurrence. So how did I begin this journey? Well, I knew nothing about the archives when at age 50, I embarked on the process to find my story. Some might say it was a midlife crisis, but when you do not know that story, where you struggle to belong, where the intergenerational trauma was and continues to be prevalent through your family, it was important not just for me, but for my children and my grandchildren that I did so. As I began my search to understand our family story, I came across the telegram. In fact, it was the first thing that I'd located. And it opened up the possibilities that I had not seen or known before. From adoptee, survivor to family genealogist, I started with my family ancestry to trace kinship, lineage, and to understand my adoption, my mother's institutionalisation, and Nan's life of slavery. The more I uncovered, the more my role morphed into historian, navigating how to weave stories of the past within stories of the present that document how First Peoples have struggled to survive the policies of colonisation that sought to annihilate, make invisible, destroy, and reconstruct traditional identities. Now, as I undertake my PhD, I'm aiming to produce a new body of work in the form of a short documentary that details the personal experiences of First Nations women as they too use the colonial archive to seek out their family stories. In the same way that I created a family cultural artefact to repatriate back to family, so will they. Through this process, it will show the possibility of exposing and exploring personal and familial connections for First Nations people who are seeking to re-author the colonial narrative. I seek to understand if this might work as a model for other First Nations people looking for their family stories. Because I think one of the things that I most commonly am aware of is that for First Nations people, our social and emotional well-being, sense of self, is grounded within a collective perspective that views self as inseparable from and embedded within family and community. It is connection to body, and to mind and emotions, to family and kinship, country, culture, spirit, to our old people. So is it possible that the process of reauthoring family narratives can validate the transformative effect and the decolonising possibilities created by reconstructing new family cultural artefacts? The way in which I describe cultural family artefacts, particularly as we've, in my family not growing up with family, we didn't really have anything as such that we knew of. So this is why I suppose I created the historical biography and call it a family cultural artefact. But for me, it's about exploring how reclaiming, reauthoring and retelling new family narratives play a significant role in locating voice and belonging to address individual, family and community identity. But it's also about intergenerational healing. The possibilities of reconstructing new cultural artefacts raises questions about voice, representation, truth and subjectivity that have been silenced or omitted from mainstream discourse, and challenges accepted methods of historical truths and talks back to the archives. But these archives of state control can also be dangerous, not to mention traumatic for those that have been subjected to them. They are painful and problematic, and there are major challenges in efforts to decolonise them, but they're also equally important. In fact, I've come to recognise that there is a duality to the archival records. While they have in the past been instruments of oppression and the construction of a negative view of First Nations identity, they can in the present and future play an important reconciling role in recovering identity and memory and reuniting families. I mean, without the telegram, I probably, I know that I had not even thought of a great-grandfather. I'd only was thinking about my mother, or myself, my mother and my grandmother. So the fact that that was the first thing that I found really led me to the journey to investigate, who is this grandfather and what happened to my grandmother. My scholarship speaks mostly of culture, of identity, of strengths, and the social and emotional well-being behaviours. I talk only of my lived experience, bringing to the forefront a deep understanding of the intergenerational impacts of forced and coercive removal. Some of the photos that I'm showing up on the screen now are at the end of 2019, after I'd submitted my exegesis and the historical biography. I took family members back to Alice Springs. For the first time, I was able to go and meet family out on country. And so these are just some of the photos of me with my family. By using the theoretical framework and the methods for First Nations people described by Aileen Morton Robinson as the ways of knowing, being and doing, in this way, I seek to reclaim identity by knowing our family background and our story through our own use of archives so that we can reconnect to the places and culture of our family and community. By using this method, I am storing my cultural identity to reveal hidden histories of state-based oppression and sites of colonial power that are systemic, racialised and gendered. I have and continue to delve into critical intergenerational stories from an Aranda standpoint as a compelling personal testimony told through only my lived experience. It is my blood memory journey through the archives as a critical creative process to truth-telling, to address the professional discourse of historians. I continue to contest the historical record through a critique of the colonial archive as a site of persuasion through what Dr. Natalie Harkin terms her sovereign expression. This emerging scholarship points to the importance of reauthoring our stories to provide a sense of identity. The expression itself refers to the statement, "Nothing about us without us." It is a phrase that represents our rightful call as First Nations people to control our destinies and to be given decision-making powers over things that affect us at all levels of government and leadership. My work aims to shift the disruptive paradigm of disconnection, loss of identity, language and culture, by decolonising the state archives to address the professional discourse, by speaking Black and contesting the historical record. By its very nature, my research continues to explore how voice, belonging and connection talks back to that colonial narrative. In this way, I honour the voices of family and community, giving greater authority and ownership to First Peoples as a way to ensure that the generational stories that form bridges between oral traditions and written history are never forgotten. It means that we reclaim our stories, not ones written about us, but stories written by us. My nan and my mother had no voice, no choice. I grew up not knowing culture or dance or language, but now I have the responsibility to uphold my cultural obligations to and for my family. We need our kids to be strong in culture, to own their identity, to be able to provide them with a safe space for them to grow up in their own skin. And obviously that's what drives me to do what I do. And I thought I'd read my presentation to you in the way in which I have. It also assists me to overcome my extreme anxiety that I have in doing these presentations. And I wanted to finish this part of the presentation with a short clip that I think, Rashani, you might be able to, I'll just stop sharing my screen, that you might be able to then put up the small clip. It's funny, I do show that clip around a bit because Mandara always says to me, Nanny, I think I'm very special. And I'm surprised by how many people have said to me that they've seen it. And I know when the kids say to me, oh, Mum, you know, Mandara's gone viral. I mean, I thought it was some sort of disease. So I didn't understand what was going on. But this is what my work is about. It's about the future generation. I mean, I love the fact that Mandara can speak language, that he knows his dance. And I want to ensure that we have these conversations about how challenging it is for people who've been disconnected from family, from country, from culture, from language. You know, I hope that in this new piece of work that I'm doing through my PhD, that there's opens up the possibilities for, even for community, First Nations community, to find a place for compassion and kindness as we embark on those journeys. For some of us, it's really, really hard. So maybe I'll just leave it there and open to questions or comments, or I don't know, whatever else.
Thanks so much, Kathy. That was, such a powerful, rich, deep truth-telling. Such an honour to hear it.